Hello, Soccer 101 students. This week's topic is youth, so I'm going to break it up into 4 parts and start talking about the sociology of youth more broadly, 2 specific ways of thinking about young people that are in that, and then relate young people to some of the course material in the last part. So I thought a good way to start this would be for you to kind of watch a quick parody kind of satire thing that the guys from The Chaser did probably 15 years ago now. So it is a little bit dated, but I'll get you to click on the YouTube link that's in the lecture notes. The little sketch starts at 1956, 19 minutes into the show, and it's a kind of parody of what they used to do when they kind of were criticising current affair shows like A Current Affair and Back Then Today Tonight. And I think it's a really good kind of quite make the normal look strange encapsulation of the way young people are treated by the media. So if you can do that first, it only goes for about 5 minutes, and then come back and I'll get on with the lecture. Okay, so now you're back. Young people basically have a really interesting position in society. They're kind of positioned as the future, so you kind of need to look after them, they need to be good, we need to invest in them, but in many ways they're also kind of blamed a lot for all the things that are going wrong in the world. And this seems to have happened, throughout centuries, really. Here we have Socrates talking about young people. They live in luxury. They cross their legs and all this kind of weird stuff. Back then, it was seen as bad manners or whatever. This also still happens today. This is, Alan Bloom writing in the 80s. Apparently, that the rise of the Sony Walkman that put a cassette tape in it and listened to music was going to be the end of civilization. The way that kind of pop culture was now packaged up, and it ends up in what he called this kind of commercially prepackaged masturbational fantasy. Young people's practices, their cultural practices, their creative practices, their everyday life are often criticised by older people. Older people seem to kind of lose touch with what's going on in the world or what's kind of in the here and now. They often kind of become fearful of it. There's all that kind of back in my day kind of stuff. And so young people, therefore, are often blamed for things, often told they're doing things wrong, they're living their life the wrong way, if only you did things like this, this and this. And what we do in youth sociology in particular is kind of criticise that point of view. And I'll go into that throughout the lecture, the how and why of that. So firstly, what is youth? It definitely occupies an interesting kind of place in the popular imagination. We can think about this through generations, current generations, previous generations, although the concept of generation can be problematic in some ways. So there's certainly broad commonalities that many young people would share at a particular time, but really within that generation there'll be just as many kind of inequalities, through class, gender, race, location and stuff like that. Frequently, the idea of moral panic is a good way to think about what's going on with the way young people are kind of represented in the world. They're kind of seen as kind of hope for the future. They're beautiful, their bodies and kind of lifestyles are used in advertising and pop culture all the time. But on the other side, they're kind of constantly criticised for doing that as well. So young people are kind of this object that many of the world's kind of problems and issues are kind of discussed through, and they're often scapegoated for. So in relation to this, Pierre Bourdieu, who we looked at throughout the course, kind of pointed out that in many ways youth, young people, it's just a word. And the division between old and young is kind of a particular socially constructed boundary of power. Older people dominate young people. And this kind of notions of generations and the way they relate is particularly problematic in that way. I've written a paper about the kind of aspects of this called Figures of Youth and the different figurative ways that young people are used and represented and symbolically kind of misused. So if you're interested in aspects of that, then please check that out. But more broadly, youth, in terms of the way we define it, has a number of different ways of thinking about it. There's a kind of the official bureaucratic policy version of it, which is about 15 to 25 or 15 to 28. The way that we use it in youth studies, though, is more of a kind of concept, a kind of transitional period between being a child and an adult. A child is kind of someone that's kind of looked after as irresponsible. An adult is someone that looks after themselves and has independence. youth is this kind of transitionary liminal space in between those periods where you're kind of moving from one to the other. What's interesting about youth studies as a field over the past 30 years is we've found that many of those markers of adulthood, leaving the home and finding your own place to live, getting educated and getting a full-time job, finding a partner and, getting married and having kids, are happening later and later in life. While those markers of adulthood were largely ticked off by about 25 in previous generations, in the 90s and before, today those things are happening a lot later, if they're happening at all. And so what's interesting about youth studies, it's kind of destroyed its own object in a way. The youth kind of transitional period seems to be extending. And again, there's all kinds of interesting moral panics around that, that young people apparently eat too many avocados and can't buy a house and stuff like that, that kind of starts to come into explaining those things. So there's lots of moral panics about young people. They've been constant for decades, and there's some really great research and really great books about this kind of stuff. Stanley Cohen's book, Moral Panics, about the mods and rockers is the kind of foundational one. The movie Quadrophenia is kind of about that, if you're interested in checking that out, where there was this kind of clash between two subcultures, the mods and the rockers, Brighton Beach in the 60s. But it was kind of, reported and distorted and sensationalized as this kind of massive riot that kind of misrepresented what was going on. And then there was all these kind of constant news stories about, how, the mods and the rockers were kind of emblematic of all that was wrong in the world. So there's constant kind of rites of passage kind of stuff, deviance, lifestyle choices. And what's interesting about these panics too is they take on a number of different forms. Often young people are seen like a risk or a threat to society. But then there's the moral panics about young people being on the receiving end of threats and risks and, interventions into their lives and predators and all that kind of stuff. Again, there's much media is based on this. It's very click-worthy. And there's a clip there if you want to check that out, back to another old story that was on Today Tonight and kind of keep the current affair thing going here, that talks about a particular terrible event that happened where there was a couple of young teens that committed suicide, but it was then blamed on their subculture, which makes absolutely no sense in any kind of empirical way. So again, if you want to check that out, there's kind of a kind of content warning there, but it's again a really good example of how framing of young people's issues and their lives and their problems distorts the reality of what's going on. In that story, you'll see that there's a kind of a sensible researcher saying that it's kind of silly to blame what happened here on their subculture, but then the majority of the story is actually blaming the subculture. Again, so here what you have is rather than think about what's going on in young people's lives, the problems they face, and addressing some of the structural issues, whether that's inequalities, whether that's marginalisation, whether that's bullying, whether that's feelings of hopelessness in terms of the future and the rise of wars and fascism and all that kind of stuff. The way that the media and politics tends to react to these things is to blame the young person, or if not the young person specifically, blame some kind of collective thing that they're doing that they see as wrong. And I'll talk about subcultures more in other parts of the lecture to kind of expand upon that. And so what youth studies tends to do is actually critically engage with those dominant moral panic understandings of young people's lives and, specific issues and events. I think this graph here, a little bit dated now, but it's just got worse, if anything, is a good example of what I'm talking about. The economic, financial, structural situation that young people are born into at the moment is nothing like it was for previous generations. And here, the very prominent stuff about buying a house is a good place to start. In 1990, where the average wage was just over 25 grand, the median price of a unit, an apartment unit in Sydney was $135,000. So what's that? About 5 times the average wage. In 2021, when the average wage was about 70 grand, it's now up to 830,000, which is, 10, 12, 13 times. I think in the last 5 or 6 years, it's gone up to 17, even in some places 20 times. I think the average house price, which is obviously going to be more than a unit or apartment price, is now up to about $1.7 million in Sydney. So the structural constraints, the cost of living constraints on young people are very much harder now than they were in the past. You'll hear some people argue that, think about interest rates and all that kind of stuff in the 80s and 90s were more as well, but And that's true, and there was definitely difficulty for many people paying off their houses then. But to actually get into the market now is virtually impossible for an ever-increasing amount of young people unless you've got intergenerational wealth and help that's being passed down to you. So this is a really good example of the kind of playoff between inequality and generations. Young people today as a group face a much harder market to get into, but what that means is they need to rely on their own families and previous generations in their own lives to help them. Obviously that means that inequality now plays an even bigger role in who can access the housing market. I think now, if the bank of mum and dad was an actual bank, it would be giving out as much money as being ranked the fifth biggest bank in Australia in terms of mortgage lending. So this is a good example, I think, of the playoff between thinking about generations as kind of having commonalities and more broadly thinking about the inequalities within them. Young people are born into the world with certain situations, structural, economic, cultural, political, but then they need to face and make a life in those circumstances, based upon their own socialisation, which we've looked at throughout the course. And that's there where things like, race, class, ethnicity, and gender play a real role in terms of, who has access to a kind of comfortable and satisfying life. So, what is youth studies? It's not just research on young people. What we like to say in our centre is that we don't do research on young people, we do research with young people. We have a critical orientation to the many interventions in young people's lives. Now, even if those interventions in young people's lives have good intentions, and what's important here is that youth studies tends to also then critically engage with many of the expertise kind of disciplines that have influence on young people's lives, particularly in the criminal justice system, youth work, social work, education systems. We see these kind of systems as being kind of helpful for young people, and in many ways they are, but also what they do is tend to replicate inequalities, place young people in a position of institutionalised mistrust, where their own kind of feelings and wants and needs are very rarely addressed, and they're kind of left there as artefacts of expertise, kind of putty for other kind of experts to mould into what they want. And from this point of view, we see that many of these institutions, therefore, are more interested in making young people into kind of pliant workers or good citizens, rather than really caring too much about their own happiness or satisfaction, or thinking too much about how their own structural position may have real effects on their opportunities and life chances. So youth studies is interesting really in telling young people's stories from their own point of view. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, therefore the research is biased, but as we've looked at throughout the course, all research is kind of biased in one way or another. What we need to do is be reflexive about that, ensure that our methods are robust and legitimate. And what we do in our work is often do workshops and interviews and focus groups and stuff like that with young people, so they actually have a voice to speak back against the things that are constraining them or the things that are helping them. And we argue that this kind of is really helpful for actually intervening in ways that young people are currently marginalised. Okay, I'll leave it there and come back and talk about youth cultures.